I want to consider surprise in three areas of experience. One is from an epistemic perspective, a perspective that deals with traditional concepts of temporalization and the constitution of time. And the reason I want to do this is because surprise is commonly held to be motivated by something unexpected or associated with the unexpected or something sudden. And this presupposes the structure of temporal continuity. The second area, I want to compare what I'm going to call this, on that earlier level, a kind of a disequilibrium that arises in surprise on a perceptual level to a diremptive experience that emerges in certain moral emotions like embarrassment, shame, guilt, humiliation. And then in a final section, I want to look at a different experience, the moral emotion of humility, and look at its unique temporal structure and see if surprise can still be equated or presuppose something like the unexpected. And I'm going to conclude, not in this case with a lot of assertions about what it should be, but different possibilities how we can then take up this experience of surprise. Okay, so the first section concerns the basic perceptual experience notion of expectation, disappointment, and surprise, and the basic effect of life. So within the phenomenological tradition, we can discern certain temporal modes, and these are ways in which something is given temporally as presentation, something given in the present, or retention, and the future dimension that's either protension, expectation, or anticipation. I would distinguish those three levels. But briefly put, a protension is a functional, anonymous sketching out of the future that's based on a present occurrence and how that occurrence was retained as past. So, for example, while I take notes reading my book that I'm working on, teaching, my bodily comportment is directly and implicitly related to what's following. From sitting in a chair to the movement of my hands and eyes as I continue to read, all of which may be fulfilled or disappointed by the oncoming events. So now as I want to take notes or sip a cup of coffee, I reach again for my pencil while I'm still reading the book. And so these protensional threads of my guide my hand to where I last placed my pencil. So I want to take a note. And I go to grasp it and miss it, and grasp it and miss it, and grasp it and miss it, and so on. And this can go on implicitly while I'm still concentrating on reading the passage. So though protension in this case is functioning through and through, taking me in this fumbling manner to where the pencil was, it doesn't include any explicit judgment about or inference of where the pencil is, and there's not necessarily any emergence of surprise. So I may get frustrated, I may turn my attention to the pencil, I may look around and hope to find it again, but surprise here has not necessarily emerged, either rupturing, calling into question, or supplanting this kind of temporal kinesthetic process of a protension, although it could be a disappointed perception. Now, an expectation, I think, is similar to a protension insofar it's open to a future occurrence of something arriving in the present, as it were, and it's kind of unfurled from the present and past. But it's different from a protension insofar as an expectation is a more active comportment to the future. So, for example, having observed the recent air currents, weather patterns, and cloud formations, I can expect it to be a mild and sunny day. In order to discern how a surprise could be relevant now to a protension, and let me just say, as an anticipation, I would say something like a heightened orientation. Like one example I always think of is waiting or anticipating the ball to drop in Times Square, as opposed to this other example of expecting the weather to be. So I want to look at the so-called belief structure, and I mean this more in a phenomenological sense, not an active sense of I believe that, but this relation to being or positing being, or a basic relation to what something is, and that's what I mean by belief here, and this in terms of certain futural modes of givenness. So intrinsic to the act of expectation, like a protension, is the fact that it implicitly posits the existence of something futurely. Again, it's not an active positing, but it's a relation to what is. And in this way, an expectation is carried out as a kind of unbroken belief, as an unbroken, straightforward relation to something in the future. When I see the mail person drive up, the person who delivers the mail, that sense of mail, drive up to the house, I expect him to drop off a package, and when I expect him to drop off the package, I implicitly am related to the existence of the mail carrier, the package, and so on. So I live in the mode of a kind of natural acceptance. This is another way of saying that when I expect something, I expect it immediately as actual and not possible. When I see the truck pull away, I accept its actual pulling away and not, in this case, its possible pulling away. In this sense, expectation is not a modalization of belief. It's a straightforward orientation in the direction of a futural actuality. So we count on something in this futural event as foreshadowed. So expectation is we can call it a temporal belief act that is oriented, or temporal belief orientation that's directed toward the future as a mode of time consciousness, and arises as motivated on the basis of the present and past. The actuality that's posited in this kind of straightforward expectation can, however, be modalized in something like a possibility, a probability, or a likelihood, or even as a surprise. Having understood expectation in this way, I think it's easier to see the distinctiveness of something like surprise. Surprise can be understood, this is initially anyway, as a kind of belief modality or belief posture that is receptive or accepting in the mode of something like, I can't believe that I believe. So in the example of the mail truck, I may expect that something else might possibly occur. I may panic in an instant that it has stopped or turned into oncoming traffic. And this would rupture my expectation or maybe instigate a new one. But in the expectation itself, in this instance, the so-called possibility is lived as actually going to occur in that mode of belief. That is, the modalization in relation to being is expressed as something like, I can't believe, so I'm caught off guard. But it's also a belief posture in relation to being because it's an acceptance of it, like, I can't believe that I believe. So that this is happening, that I see it, that I experience it, that it's present. So I think in this instance of a perceptual level, we have this very peculiar orientation to its being, but as I can't believe it's going to happen, or I can't believe it's happening, or I can't believe it's happened. And I'm expressing it in more active terms than what's really is going on, but there's this little twist in it, I think, that's going on in relation to being. So it's still a doxic mode, in Husserlian terms, a belief mode in relationship to what is. So put in more colorful terms, perhaps, we could say that surprise is the experience of something else that issues in the explosion or the shattering of the noema, those more colorful Husserlian terms. But so it looks like certain things that might be essential to the experience of surprise, namely a rupture of experience, something occurring that's not expected, and a kind of discordance of a concordance of experience. So I want to ask another question. Can surprise be something that takes place merely on the anonymous level of experience? This could be understood as something like so-called pre-egoic or pre-reflective level of experience. So if we examine a discordance of an otherwise concordant experience, like walking down the stairs while conversing with a friend, a misstep might constitute a rupture of that experience of walking. And if I'm very much absorbed in the conversation, I may not even notice the misstep until after I reflect on what happened, how I scuffed my shoes or how I hurt my knee or something like that. But even if something is placed in my way and I trip and I regain my footing, this may be unexpected. It may rupture my gait, but it wouldn't necessarily be surprise. I don't think so, since simply because things don't go according to how we expect them to run their course does not necessarily mean that it's surprising. That is, we could experience a rupture of experience, a rupture or a discordance as an anomaly. It could be integrated merely within a passive level of experience. So another way of putting this is that not every non-fulfillment or disappointment of an expectation motivates any kind of egoic turning toward. The further point I would like to suggest here is that if surprise occurs, it can never merely occur on a passive level or as a mere rupture in a pre-reflective, so-called passive associative experience. Surprise will always therefore involve at least a minimal or an attentive being turned toward. If not act, I don't mean in the sense of active turning toward, but an attentive being turned toward, an effective being turned toward as a sense of I'm caught off guard or I'm thrown back on the experience. And that has to do with that little twist in this, I can't believe I believe it. So thrown back on the experience. So there are also examples that constitute a more attentive awakening or turning toward. So for example, I'm listening to my friend speak about a special plant, and then all of a sudden he mentions a fern, and I think about my time in the forest, and I turn my attention in remembering to the forest. Or I could hear dripping water from a leaky ceiling. That is fixed now, by the way, in the center. But, and such that it eventually effectively arouses my attention to examine what has become an annoying noise. This is an active turning toward from a kind of passive preoccupation or an occupation, and it has an effective resonance. But it would not necessarily be surprise. I could just be curious when I'm turning toward. So my contention here is that on this level, surprise has to be understood as more than an unexpected givenness and more than a turning toward a kind of effective allure. And so for those of you who are familiar with Husserl's passive synthesis, a lot of this terminology about effective allure and turning toward is really playing off of that.
Could you say that last two sentences again? It has to be understood as more than what?
I will tell you as soon as I find it. What did I say? Oh, it has to be more than a turning toward an effective allure. So while surprise seems to presuppose a rupture or a disappointed expectation and a kind of turning toward or being turned toward as at least an invitation to a more active motive comportment, and while a certain coming into relief effectively can be a prerequisite for surprise, surprise seems to be more or different than that. It seems to be more of an affected awakening or turning toward that is itself effective, or something that bears an effective resonance. It's never effectively neutral. So thus we can say surprise is minimally an effectively affective relation to emergent being or non-being. I'll read it again, but this is a very clumsy formulation. So minimally an effectively affective relation to emergent being or non-being as exercising an effective allure. So it's more than an experience of a mere rupture, disappointment, non-fulfillment, or something unexpected. So in this way, I can't believe I believe. Okay. Now, this is what I'd like to call, just as a kind of a marker, a disequilibrium in the experience. And I want to distinguish this from what I want to call a disequilibrium. Disequilibrium. Because I think what's happening here is that we're thrown back on an experience, but this is different from being thrown back on myself, which happens in certain other experiences and certain other emotions, like embarrassment or shame. And furthermore, we usually think of surprise in terms of the suddenness of something. I'll come to that in just a moment. Or the suddenness of something arising, but it doesn't seem that suddenness is necessarily a temporal feature for surprise. For example, it surprises me that my friend acted this way, and I'm still surprised that he continues to act this way. This may be a startling discovery, but it's not sudden, or it's not characterized only by suddenness. So in differentiating surprise, or even something like wonder, or awe on the basis of suddenness, this is probably not sufficient. I'm not going to go into awe and wonder, but I don't think that the suddenness is now a sufficient way of characterizing them. Something might be startling in the sense that it doesn't correspond to my belief posture or orientation, and this new emergence of something may not be easily integrated. It could be a spontaneous occurrence in the sense that it's happening, evoking a spontaneous attentiveness and calling my orientation, not me, or into question. And it could be an affected effectiveness that is, as I say, effectively tuned. But this is not a way of being given to myself. And this is what I want to look to now. Just as a kind of comparison. So I want to begin with, so now I want to look at certain, what I'm calling diremptive experiences. And I'll just begin with a simple example. I show up at someone's house and discover, when I take off my shoes, that I have holes in my socks. Or I misstep and trip while trying to impress a group of friends. In this case, I might be embarrassed. Embarrassment here, it has a kind of rupture in the experience. So it seems, I'm mentioning these because they have certain similarities, but they're distinctive. So it's a rupture of an experience. An event could disrupt my expectation and so on. But in this case, it's given as incidental to my character. So it's not the fact that I have holes in my socks, but it's the fact that its experience is something incidental to my character. You know, I'm usually well dressed, but now I have holes in my socks, or I forgot to put them on or something. I'm usually graceful, but I tripped in front of my friends. It doesn't impinge, in that sense, on a general basic sense of self. My point here is that whatever I experience, and if it's constituted in embarrassment, it's going to be experienced as a diremption or an infraction. And diremption, there's a split in the experience, that something occurs on the basis of another sense, of a basic sense of self, as a concordant experience. And I'm revealed to myself in a certain way in this experience, even if momentarily, and before others. And so this is where it's beginning to contrast now, this kind of rupture with something like surprise. Now, shame emerges. It could be the same experience, same direct experience, but something else differently is happening in shame. Shame emerges when this lived diremption is given as more than a mere infraction. That is, when the event or the action qualifies me in a certain way and threatens the reconfiguration of my character. So it's against the background of my character or my basic orientation that the event or action will be given not merely as an anomaly, but as emergent of a new kind of discordant concordance. And just as a quick reflection, it's interesting that in the Tanakh, that or the Hebrew Bible, the Judeo-Christian Bible, that the first emotion, which I would have expected to be guilt, is not guilt; it's shame. And it's interesting that it doesn't have to do with Adam appearing or Eve appearing naked or anything. It's like God saying, "Where are you?" Well, of course, it's not like, "Oh, I don't know where you are," but how are you oriented toward me? And Adam is oriented in that moment as being disoriented, and that's that diremptive experience, and that's what gives rise to shame. It's also interested in I think, in Levinas. In a lot of his descriptions, you'd think he'd be talking about guilt, but it's also shame. And I don't think that it's so much that it's a Judaic issue, but it's that it's getting at the core of these experiences in the presence of another, that one is revealed to oneself as either oriented in a particular way or disoriented. And so on the other hand, in the case of Adam and Eve, this disorientation is still shame. So it's a disorientation on the basis of an orientation that's still more basic. Adam and Eve are still oriented toward God, but with a disorientation. If they weren't, then they'd just be something else entirely. So instead of, a reason why I call it a diremptive experience is because they're not two different experiences, but one is enveloped within another. And so it's a disorientation on the basis of a more basic orientation, enough to threaten it, but not enough that it's two different ones. And that's what makes it distinctive from embarrassment. It's not that it's more social, it's not that it has more weight, it has to do with this character of, I mean, as opposed to a lot of the analytic literature on this. It has to do with these two competing levels. So what we have is a co-givenness of this experience, this diremptive experience that could establish a new concordance, but doesn't entirely. And one is given as more basic. So these two experiences, and one's given as more basic. And if you didn't, you just have two different ways of being. So I'm revealed to myself before another with the possibility of critique, which is why shame has a negative valence, will always be experienced with a negative valence, but its result could be positive. And so I would distinguish something like shame from a disabilitating shame, as maybe I'll say that in a little bit later, like in the case of maybe humiliation, that would be negative, but not because it has a negative valence. And those are often conflated in the literature. Just because it has a negative valence doesn't mean that it's a negative emotion. Okay, now let me just look at another kind of diremptive experience of humiliation. And humiliation belongs here in the context of shame, not in the context of humility. By humiliation, I understand a kind of destructive force as being exposed to mockery, subject to ridicule, being reduced to powerlessness before others. It includes kind of being stripped down before others who are in power, who remain in power, and it targets the basic sense of the integrity of the person for all to see. In an interpersonal nexus, we'd find in experiences that like love or trust, that this would be a disorientation. If I'm humiliated by another before another. I'm both presupposed as person and yet actively depersonified. And this takes place whether or not I am surprised by the humiliation. This is what makes the process so powerful. I can only be subject to humiliation because there is at least an implicit sense of my personal integrity to be humiliated. It's a kind of depersonalization on the basis of an interpersonal nexus. In this regard, humiliation can be understood as a diremptive experience as well, because I'm given to myself in a way that's in tension with a more basic orientation. In this case, my personal self-presence. But humiliation sustains this active tension. I cannot humiliate a person who does not have a sense of him or herself as a person, but I can surprise a person who does not have a sense of him or herself as a person. This is perhaps just another way of saying that while surprise unfolds on an affective level, humiliation takes place on an emotional or a personal one. However, as opposed to embarrassment or shame, there's nothing corrective that could come out of humiliation. Shame, for example, can keep the personal sense of the individual intact. I'm thrown back on myself, and I'm revealed to myself as who I am in this dynamic sense of becoming. Humiliation, on the other hand, targets me as destroying the personal integrity in question. It's not open to a positive critique or a reorientation of who I am, but holds me at a disorientation from who I am before others and as subject to others. So we can see a difference between something like surprise, shame, and humiliation in the following example. I could come up behind a child playing hide and seek in a store and yell, "Boo!" to the child and surprise him or her. Okay. And he may laugh or cry. Or I could scold the child in public, saying, "You should be ashamed of yourself," from the perspective of a shared homeworld. The child might be surprised by her mother's or father's exhortation and be shamed at the same time. But this is much different from humiliating the child, opening him or her to the derision of others in a manner such that the child could not recover from this kind of experience. Like, bringing the child's faults out in front of strangers or something like that. When I'm humiliated, I'm made to feel less than who I am, and only that. So whereas evoking shameful behavior in a scold could still take place in a loving attitude that wants to draw the child back to his or her true self, humiliation only wants to disparage, ridicule, or reduce the other to an object in order to exert control. Whereas surprise might be a kind of spontaneous diremption, humiliation holds the experience at this kind of disorientation without the possibility of future recovery. Well, in that instance of it, not that one couldn't recover, but the point is that its internal sense is interpersonal, but it's realized as a kind of violent rupture of that interpersonal context. So, and further, while I can be embarrassed before others because of something that I do, in humiliation, it is others who makes me appear in this way before others. So we have a different relationship of otherness in all of these experiences. So my point in doing in that section is just to point out different ways in which we have experiences of rupture in different levels of experience that are not reducible to surprise and that have a different relationship to otherness and have a different kind of valence in those experiences. So let me now turn to the issue of humility. So having distinguished something like being caught off guard from the being called into question, the kind of disequilibrium from a diremption peculiar to certain moral emotions, not all of them, but certain of them, I would now like to examine the case of humility and its temporality to see if it can clarify what is essential to the experience of surprise. Loving and humility are intimately related, and I understand their difference in terms of an experiential emphasis. Loving is an immediate and direct opening to another, any other, in the integrity of what it is or who the person is toward the fullest realization with respect to its own sphere of being a person, a tool, a work of art, or so on. Here the focus is on the other and is characterized as a movement originating on the one hand from the beloved as invitational, on the other toward the other as an initiatory movement of the lover. Humility is this openness and dynamic movement, but where the experiential resonance is now on how I receive myself as who I am from another. In both cases, and the point here in terms of humility, it's the myself, when I'm revealed to myself, that myself is essentially relational and given as not self-grounding. So these are all, from the very beginning, relational. Pride is also interpersonal, and it presupposes an implicit movement toward others, but it's a movement that includes others by resisting their contributions. So pride is really a twofold movement. I'm mentioning pride to distinguish it from humility just briefly. It's a subjective self-movement as a resistance to others. Or, put differently, pride is a moral emotion that belongs to the moral dimension of experience because it's a resistance to others and to their contributions to shared meaning, in and through asserting myself as the only or the highest source of meaning. So it includes others by excluding them. I'm given to myself in pride as self-grounding, and I arrive at my priority, including others, by excluding them. So in terms of its relation to pride, humility can be understood as a recovery of the interpersonal dimension, a dimension that pride obfuscates through its resistance, such that humility is not first a decentering of the self. In this sense, humility is not first and foremost a self-forgetfulness, but vis-a-vis pride, a repositioning of myself, a recovery of the interpersonal dimension that is implicit even in pride, and as a result, is a disposition of the prideful self. Thus, if humility is how I am self-given through being given over to another, as having been called forth by another, if we gain myself through this kind of moral reduction, if we wanted to use that term, if this is the case, then we can understand humility as a recovering in the sense of realizing myself as interpersonal, and not a forgetfulness of self, but a recovery of the interrelational self, interpersonal sense of myself. Okay. So trying to escape myself by being humble, trying to lose myself in a project that does not constitute humility because I'm still encumbered with myself in this isolated sense. I would still be I would be this point of departure and point of return. being humble is not undertaken then as a project to lose myself or forget myself. This would fall under the critique, that Nietzsche leveled as well, kind of as a false altruism or a ressentiment. It would really be grounded in a kind of self-hatred, which I probably have mentioned before. All the talk about the other, through Levinas. I mean, not Levinas, but I'm wondering if a lot of this isn't just like I'm clinging to the other because I can't stand myself. So, which is where a lot of the literature is. I mean, I don't know. Anyway. So through this positive movement from and toward the other as an attitude of devotion or service, there's an acceptance and reception, the acknowledgement of gift, and a therefore self-forgiveness, and therefore a response to pride. Yet what is self-given in the movement of humility arises spontaneously as myself in this relational sense, as myself is oriented toward things without attachment, toward myself as not self-grounding, as interpersonal, and the reception of myself in the accusative. Okay, now, since we looked at the ways in which I'm thrown back on myself and the way that I'm revealed to myself and is susceptible to all sorts of other ways of self-givenness, I want to look briefly at the question of self-givenness in humility. If we were to examine the emotions of self-givenness, this is all within the context of trying to see what we can say about surprise and how I'm disposed or not disposed toward that. If we were to examine the emotions of self-givenness like pride, shame, or guilt, we'd find that they are conducive quite easily to a phenomenological analysis or first-person analysis, not only because I'm given to myself in these very experiences, but also because I can reflect on this self-givenness and describe it as it's taking place, more or less. Here I become the explicit theme of the experience, even if such an experience amounts to a self-dissimulation, like in the case of pride. So, what kind of self-givenness is involved in something like humility? So let's look at another example. If I were to present a group design project as my own work, it could make sense to reflect on it and think, wow, I'm really being prideful right now, and disdain it or embrace it. I might experience surprise if someone else stood up and took credit for it. And as it was going on, despite the suddenness of this revelation, consider to be surprised, I can't believe this person's standing up and taking credit for all this work that I did. If I look at the way that the other team members and judges look at me for grandstanding, for taking all the credit in this case, it might make me, I may feel shame, and I could describe it as such. And if I take all the credit and the prize money for winning the design, I could experience guilt and describe the experience as it's taking place. But when describing the communal effort that went into the design, where the focus is on the design and the cooperation, it doesn't seem possible at that very moment reflectively to describe my experience in humility. I, in some sense, disappear as the focal point of the experience of humility, which is one reason why humility evades the same kind of first-person present description that we find in emotions of self-givenness, like in pride, shame, or guilt. Nevertheless, the difficulty of describing humility as I experience it in the first person is also a clue to the very experience of humility. It's a clue insofar as this difficulty corresponds loosely to this loss of self, although the loss of self is not the starting point of it. Because humility is given as I am disposed toward another, I do not find myself as humble in the first-person experience now. Like shamelessness, humility, however, can be given from a first-person plural perspective, from an IU perspective, and so on. Or another could be exemplary of humility for me. So is it accessible in a certain way, but not in the way in which other first-person experiences are given. So phenomenologically speaking, the reduction is not a remaindering or finding something left over after putting my prejudices out of play, but a kind of liberation. Through the epoche, a reduction, the phenomena are liberated. The style of liberation is operative in the epistemic as well in the moral sphere, I think. In this kind of moral reduction of humility, I am reduced to myself. I'm reduced to myself as relational. And this reduction to myself, and here's a capital M, which for me means as a relational sense, is expansive or interpersonal, such that I'm given to myself as not self-grounding. It's already relational. In that sense, liberating. Humility is a being revealed to myself as related to another, as accepting from another, as accepting the givenness from another and the contributions from others. Accordingly, the eclipse of self-givenness, where I'm the explicit theme, does not mean that there is no self-givenness in humility, because I can receive myself as a recovery of this interrelational sense of self. Now, I want to look more explicitly at the temporality of humility. I began with considerations of the temporality for the experience of surprise, and now I want to consider this in relationship to humility. Not every futural opening of an experience is an expectation or founded in one, nor the rupture of the unexpected or the non-fulfillment is it necessarily applicable in the same experiences that have a unique temporality. Hoping, for instance, has a different temporal meaning from an expectation. I do not expect or wait for something when I hope. Rather, hoping is characterized as kind of a sustainable awaiting enduringly. While I might be disappointed that a hoped-for object or event does not arise, I would not be surprised if the so-called impossible did not occur, if I hope. So it also has a different, and it's not founded in expectation either. That's a different story. My point simply is that there are many different kinds of temporal experiences that don't have the structure of an expectation. We can find it in trusting, we can find it in loving, we can find it in hoping, and in repentance. These all have their own unique kind of temporal or futural orientation that's not a matter of an expectation. So if we think about the way in what's happening in the living present, perceptually, something is given now, and this presentational givenness is also retained or lingers with a varying affective resonance. As a retention of the now, there is no possibility of the retention being disappointed because there's not an intentional relation at all. This kind of presentational now is connected, this kind of now retention constitutes a style of unfolding that says how something is how it will be received or how it is to come. We can also actively turn our attention toward what is expected, one step following another, the outcome of a game, the return on an investment, the behavior of a colleague, or the actions of a friend. Even here, the present and retention constitute a style of unfolding. An unfolding that can be ruptured and disappointed, of course, but they can only undergo a rupture and a disappointment because that same concordant style is given as projected in this way. My point here is that in either case, as a kind of so-called passive protension or active expectation, these modes of futural temporal givenness are eclipsed in humility. We have a first clue that humility is different from the protensional or anticipatory movement of a perceptual presentation, or even what is given effectively in order to be surprised, insofar as there is no expectation functional in humility. Or rather, the intentionality of expectation is elided. In humility, I have no just desserts. In a twofold sense here. First, humility is not a matter of justice in the sense of a third-party adjudication. It's not to say that justice is not important in certain situations. This is not a matter of humility. Second, I do not dispose myself to another expecting something in return with the attitude of like, I deserve this or that. Thus, there can be no disappointment in humility. Such a reception or acceptance with no just deserts is what qualifies humility. I do not expect a return on my efforts. There's no expectation, in fact. There's no motivation of merit, big or small. There's no regard of justice to me, due or done. There is no expectation of a fulfillment through what I intend. This temporal mode of expectation is simply not functional in humility. This is not to say that I do not, as a human person, expect anything as I move around an object or in all sorts of different social situations. But in humility, there's nothing to expect. Or to expect nothing in humility means in the moral sphere that I deserve nothing, which is why everything in humility is received as gift. And this is why I suggest that disappointment is not operative in humility as a moral emotion. Likewise, when one receives in humility, what is received as gift, and only post facto is humbling. Only after the fact do I feel myself as undeserving, for which humility would find no end. Again, humility admits of no intention, no fulfillment, no disappointment in the customary perceptual sense. This is why Shaler writes that in humility one accepts all things with thanks, from the most subtle pleasure to the grandest bliss. We do this without ever imagining that we deserve even the smallest part, he writes. So we can conceive of a surprise gift, like a poem from a friend. That is not a rupture, but an overwhelming presence, an undeserved presence, which is not identifiable with the unexpected. In fact, in humility, one might always be surprised without ever expecting anything, which is to say, one's always open. Or, for this to be reduced to a mere rupture would presuppose only one kind of givenness, a kind of perceptual givenness, or the givenness what I call presentation, and not the givenness of revelation. In humility, I find no end, because the very tenor of the movement is governed by an ever deeper openness, where the goal is not myself, or the expectation of anything, or the rupture of anything. In presentation, like in a perceptual presentation, even if I'm engrossed in things, or enjoying things, or working on them, there is an implicit or explicit expectation of the fulfillment through what I intend. I mean, that's fine. It's just, I may live in and among things, I may expect something from them, enjoyment, Levinas, or usefulness, Heidegger, or so on. And ultimately, to receive, I expect something from them, more in an implicit sense, of them, to receive something of them, or even from something of myself, in which case I could be disappointed. So, like Odysseus returning home from his Odyssey, there is and can be no humility. I remain encumbered by and with myself in the sense that I expect a return on my efforts. I merit something. But in humility, there's no expectation of return. And I do not expect that there is still something to be gained. Instead, if there's humility, there's an experience of what Annie Dillard calls unwarranted exuberances, or unmerited events, or uncalled for gifts. One could argue that something lived as unexpected is still dependent upon the expected, now as eclipsed. But even here I would argue that this unexpected is not of the same metal as a disappointed perception. Precisely nothing is foreshadowed because there's nothing in humility on the basis of which something could be expected. The structure of expectation is put out of play. So even if it's not a common or typical experience, it could happen that epistemically I expect that someone may thank me for something I did, but in fact I never expect anything at all for what I did, not even a kind of acknowledgement. And in this sense, expecting thanks does not even cross my mind. A protension or an expectation can be disappointed, but there's nothing to disappoint in humility. And we can ascertain, therefore, that humility is lived without attachment to a result or what is to come. For the same reason that I do not try to efface myself in humility, I don't try to humble myself, because once again, this would be a matter of fulfilling an expectation, and I would put myself out of that whole context. So it eclipses the moment it begins. So let me just jump now. What kind of temporality does humility exhibit, and how does this help characterize surprise? First, humility is qualified as an openness toward and a reception of, or an acceptance of what is given. Its mode of temporality relative to its mode of temporality relative to this openness, acceptance, and reception is what we might want to call a presence at. This mode of presence is the way in which I am given as being given over to or oriented toward others. This kind of presence at is reflected in a being thankful for, which does not motivate anything new to come. It does not anticipate more to be thankful for. So in this sense, it's not taken up in an expectation. Second, humility is not only related to the way in which something is accepted or received, but is also the way in which I receive myself as in and through being other-oriented, and the way in which I receive myself as having been given over to myself prior to being able to choose this for myself. So I receive myself in humility, which is to say, as not self-grounding. So there's a temporal dimension of the past that's not correlative to a remembering, since being not self-grounding is before I could remember what I could even forget. It is what we could call a generative past, a past prior to remembering a past, a presence of myself that's not just retended, but a kind of density that prepares me for who I am and how I am. Humility qualifies me as having openly received myself such that in receiving myself, a futural unfolding is released. But in this case, we'd want to call it something like an prior memorial reception, an ante-memorial reception. Even though humility doesn't entail an expectation, there's nevertheless a futural sense to humility. And this is related to the reception of what is given and an acceptance of whatever is to come, without it being an anticipation of what is to come. As a welcoming of what comes, infinitely we could say, the sense of this futural dimension is a having a disposition toward, without the imposition of a telos or a result. To say that I do not deserve something or that I do not merit is not based on the depreciation of myself, but is grounded in the overflowing or the superabundance of what is received or accepted. Futurally, it is a kind of accepting ahead without an anticipated end. It bears a kind of density of experience that is expressed as devotion toward someone or something. Even though humility is not oriented temporally like an expectation, it does have a temporal meaning, namely as a kind of accepting ahead, as devotion. So now, just to conclude, I have a couple questions that I want to ask. Surprise, on the one hand, could be seen as kind of an affective relation, at least initially, as an emergent affective presence in the sense of a doxic relation or a belief posture. And it can be understood as a kind of, I can't believe that I believe, or I can't believe what I believe. And there's a kind of experiential disequilibrium that throws me back on my experience. Now this is, or being caught off guard. And this is distinct from a diremptive experience which throws me back on myself before others. And we could have all sorts of diremption or ruptures in these other kinds of experiences. They may seem to be similar to what we have in these perceptual experiences, but are not quite related to them. But then we have the case of humility. in which case it's not a diremptive experience. It's not based on a rupture. It doesn't have an expectation in that sense. So I think, so then the question is this: how are we to characterize experience, this surprise and givingness? And I'm just going to outline two, possibly three, two areas of possibilities, maybe three different ones. So we could reserve the perceptual anonymous experience that presupposes the expectation, and the experience is something like disequilibrium, for something like what we talked about last night as the startle. We could do that. And startle concerns then perceptual sense, and surprise would concern the level of personal meaning. Or we could understand that there are different modes of givenness: a presentational mode of givenness, and then vertical ones, like what I call revelation or epiphany or manifestation, and some other ones like that. And within each form of givenness, surprise, we would hold on to surprise, but surprise would have a different meaning, or it's lived differently. In one case with an expectation, because it certainly seems to be functional to me on the level of perception, in that case, and another, or maybe even others, without expectation. Because we do have it seems to me we have the experience of surprise and humility without expectation and constantly surprised. Or mutatis mutandis in a religious experience. Similar vertical relation. In one case, it would presuppose a protension or an expectation. In the other case, it wouldn't even be at issue. It would be a different kind of futural dimension, but surprise wouldn't have any rapport with it in that way. Okay, so that's kind of the first two groupings of the first case scenario, however we wanted to decide that. And then the second basic difference would be surprise does not really presuppose a protension or expectation at all, but only seems to. Now, this is, so I personally went through those three possibilities. At first I thought, okay, surprise isn't relevant at all in the case of a moral issue. But then I realized, well, no, it really is functional humility, but there isn't an expectation. But that's what I was presupposing surprise needed an expectation. And then I thought, well, okay, surprise, that's really what we're getting at when we're doing this kind of analysis. We're saying, okay, it seems that expectation and everything and rupture and all this is really involved because of the perceptual experience, but when we really push it to its core and examine something like humility, we realize that's covering over other things that are really going on, and it doesn't presuppose an expectation. Okay, that I don't think is good. I thought it's reductive. So I would say I would toss that option out too. So I'm leaning more toward, well, I go back and forth. Either saying, we want to say something like startle belongs to a perceptual sense and humility to a level of surprise to a level of meaning. I'm not happy with that one, so I was leaning, but I'm not happy. I think we have to be more sensitive to different modes of givenness, and that we have different senses of surprise that are operative in the case of a perceptual unfolding, in which there seems to be something that's certainly more than a startle reflex going on in a perceptual experience that involves an expectation. But we clearly have something in the case of humility where surprise is in play, but without any expectation, any that kind of futural dimension at all in play.